For day 3 notes, we're going to talk about solving multi-step equations. And when we do that, we're going to talk about distributive property and combining like terms. So for distributive property, it says multiply the term outside the parentheses by the terms inside the parentheses. So you can see here in example 1, we have a number on the outside of the parentheses. And if I distribute that, I'm saying 3 times x and 3 times 8. Okay? Now, for the term, it says a number. I'm going to just use a symbol there. A number or variable, or the product of a number and one or more variables. So a term would be like 3x, or you could say 24 is a term. A constant is a term that has no variables. So what does that mean? That means it's just a number, like 6 or 10. A coefficient is a number factor of a term. So if I said like 7x, the 7 is the coefficient. And then like terms, 2 terms with the same variable factors. So an example of like terms would be 4x and say 9x. That would equal 13x. So those are like terms because they have the same variable. So in example 1, actually this whole example is just reviewing distributive property and combining like terms. So in part B, I'm going to distribute a negative 7. It's okay that the negative 7 is on this side instead of the front. So negative 7 times 5b is negative 35b. And then negative 7 times, you say negative 4, that's a positive 28. So it is okay to go from the left to the right or from the right to the left. Now in letters C and D, this is practicing the same skill. Sometimes you see a negative 1 written and sometimes you don't see the 1 written. But that negative still implies that there's a 1 there. So if I distribute my negative 1, that's going to become negative 2x, and then negative 1 times 3 would be negative 3. Here, negative 1 times 3x, negative 3x, and negative 1 times negative 7 is 7. Now, for letter E, this is just simply combining like terms, so they have the same x, so I can add those and get 10x. Now, when you write down, or when you have like more than just an x, like here I've got just numbers, right? Those are constants. Usually you write down the letters first and then you do your constant. So I see that 4x and 6x would make 10x. Negative 5 and 4 would subtract to be negative 1. In letter G, I have to distribute the negative 7. So negative 7x. Negative 7 times 5 is negative 35. And then I can bring down the 3x and the 4. So negative 7x and positive 3x, you'd have to say, okay, well those are different signs. So you subtract 7 and 3 and get 4. And then which is bigger? The 7. And the 7 is negative. So that means that the 4 is negative. And then this is pretty much the same idea. Negative 35 and 4 have different signs, so I subtract 35 and 4, 31. 35 is the bigger number, and it's negative. So 31 is negative. In letter H, you have multiple variables, so I'm going to do it in alphabetical order. So I'm going to do x's first. So 5x minus 3x is 2x. 6y plus 9y would be 15y. And then negative 3 plus 4 is positive 1. Okay. So that's just a review of combining like terms and distributive property. Now we're going to use this stuff in solving multi-step equations. So for example 2a, on this side of the equation, I see that I have these 2 terms that are alike. So 5x plus 2x is 7x. and then I just bring the rest of my equation down. Now in class we talked about making sure that you either add or subtract first and then you divide. So here I'm going to go ahead and add that 2 to the other side. So 5 plus 2 gives me 7. And to get rid of this 7 times x, the opposite or the inverse operation of multiplication is to divide. So this gives me 1. In part B, I'm looking, do I have anything that can be simplified there? Yes. The 8 and the 7 are like terms. So 8 minus 7 is 1. And then I would go ahead and solve it like a two-step equation. So I'm going to subtract the 1. So this gives me 36. Then here again, I've got that 6 times x. So if I multiply that, the opposite would be to divide it. And this would give me 6. Okay, in letter C, I have to decide, okay, what would I do to this in order to simplify this part? And because I have parentheses, I need to distribute. And this is a tricky one because it has a negative 8. So every time I multiply, I must say negative 8 times this number. So 2x. That gives me negative 16x. And then negative 8 times, that's like a negative 1. So negative 8 times negative 1 is 8. Equals 40. So now we're going to subtract 8. And negative 16x is going to equal 32 when I subtract 40 minus 8. And as my last step, you might guessed it, we're going to divide. Alright, so 32 divided by negative 16. So positive divided by a negative is a negative, and that is a 2. Okay, letter D. We have a couple things we have to do before we can actually solve it. So I'm going to distribute this 4 to my parentheses. So I'm going to do 4 times 3y and 4 times negative 5. Bring down my 2y equals 8. Now, the 12y and the 2y can combine to be 14y. And then I can bring down my minus 20 and bring down the 8. Now I've got a two-step equation, so I'm going to add 20. Remember, if I am going too fast, you can always pause and replay it. You also, in the settings, can slow me down as well. And last thing we're going to do is we're going to divide. Alright, so 28 divided by 14 gives me 2. Excellent. Now, the next part is called clearing a fraction. So I'm going to zoom in. So for letter E, I see that I have the same denominator, 3 and 3. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that 3 because it's the same, and I'm going to write it above every term. And I put parentheses just to show multiplication. So here, these two 3's, because they are the same, they cancel. And we're left with 2x. Here, the 3's are the same as well, and they cancel, leaving you with minus x. Since this is not a fraction, you multiply this. So 7 times 3 is 21. Now, when you look at this, my hope is that on this side of the equation, you see that you have 2 x's, which then means you can go ahead and combine those. You also should know that if you just have an x, there's a 1 there. So this is 2x minus 1x, which is 1x. And to solve for x, you just divide by 1. And x is 21. But what happens when you have different denominators like letter F? Well, we have to find a common denominator. And the common denominator of 4 and 3 is 12. And I can get that by multiplying 4 and 3 together. So I'm going to write 12 above every term. Now, this one isn't as nice as the last one, because in the last one, we could just cancel those numbers because they were the same. But if they're not the same, this is what you do. You go 12 divided by this bottom number, 4. So 12 divided by 4 is 3. And then you say, okay, 3 times 3x is 9x. Here, 12 divided by 3 is 4. And so 4 times x. So I would put minus from there, and then that 4x. And not a fraction, so I just multiply those and get 120. So now I'm going to go ahead and combine those like terms and get 5x equals 120. The last step would be divide by 5. And if I divide that, we get 24. Okay, we have 2 problems left, and they're both decimal. So I highly advise that you use your calculator. So when I look here, we're just going to ignore the bell. When I look here, I see that these terms on this side are not like terms. One has an x, one doesn't. So I'm going to solve this like a 2-step equation. I'm going to say, okay, if I want x by itself, then I need to get rid of the 3.5. So I'm going to subtract it to the other side there. So on this side, I have that negative 0.02x. Here, if I do the 1.24 minus 3.5, I get a negative 2.26. Now, just like the other problems, that when you have a number in front of the x, you want to divide by that number. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to divide by negative 0.02. And I would definitely use my calculator for that. So I do know, though, that a negative divided by a negative is a positive. So when I divide, I end up getting 113. Okay, last problem for day 3 notes. Here I've got 2 x's. So 2.9x minus 1.5x, this gives me a 1.4x. The plus 4.3 comes down, and the 8.22. This is set up like a 2-step equation. Okay, the only difference is it has some decimals in it. So I still want to subtract that 4.3 because those are like terms. So let's subtract it. If you want to pause and try it on your own, that would be great. So if you subtract these 2 numbers, you should have gotten a 3.92. Now, we divide by the 1.4. And we get 2.8. And that is